gentlemen. Thank you for being here. We've got a good crowd. This conversation that's shortly about to begin on inclusive growth reflects the leitmotif of this entire APEC CEO summit. President Aquino yesterday emphasized this forcefully and articulately. Inclusive growth represents an opportunity and a challenge. Let me give you some statistics to illustrate this. The Asian Development Bank, which is based right here in Manila, says that between 1990 and 2010, average Asian GDP grew by about 7% annually, lifting about 700 million people out of poverty. That's great. But there's a disconnect. Because during a similar period, the vast majority of Asians were living in countries with worsening Gini coefficients, which is a measure of income gaps. So what you have, and those countries include China, India, and Indonesia, which are among 3 of the 4 most populous nations in the world. So this is a big, serious problem. And it's not just a problem for the developing world, it afflicts the developed economies as well. We've got a terrific panel to talk about this, and there are 4 broad aspects that we will address. The first is how unequal growth hurts societies. From a moral perspective, for sure, but also from an economic one. It's bad for business. What are the causes? How should we tackle those causes? And the impact on resilience, the mitigating of tragedies and effects of natural and man-made disasters. How do we build soft as well as hard infrastructure to reinforce resilience? Let me introduce my panel today. First, I'm going to invite John Chen, who's Executive Chairman and CEO of BlackBerry, to come on stage. Alan Gabor, President and CEO of Merck Biopharma China. Donald Kanak, Chairman of Prudential Corporation Asia. Josette Sheeran, President of Asia Society. And I would like to now call to make some opening remarks, His Excellency President Chang Tan Sang of Vietnam. Please welcome.
Kính thưa quý vị, thưa các bạn, hôm nay tôi rất vui mừng được trở lại đất nước Philippines tươi đẹp và gặp gỡ đông đảo các doanh nghiệp năng động hàng đầu của khu vực. Hội nghị thượng đỉnh doanh nghiệp APEC và năm APEC 2015 nói chung đánh dấu nhiều cột mốc quan trọng mới trong hợp tác APEC của chúng ta. Tôi đánh giá cao và xin chúc mừng các bạn Philippines về năm APEC 2015 thành công tốt đẹp. Thưa các bạn, chủ đề chiến lược vì tăng trưởng công bằng và tự cường mà chúng ta sẽ thảo luận ngày hôm nay là thiết thực và đúng lúc. Đây là xu thế của thế kỷ thứ 21. Từ sau cuộc khủng hoảng tài chính kinh tế toàn cầu, tái cơ cấu kinh tế theo hướng bền vững đã trở thành chiến lược của hầu hết các nền kinh tế. Việc thông qua chương trình nghị sự 2030 về phát triển bền vững đã thể hiện sinh động quyết tâm mạnh mẽ xây dựng một thế giới bền vững và tự cường. Khu vực châu Á-Thái Bình Dương của chúng ta cũng đang trong thời điểm bước ngoặt. Nhiều thỏa thuận FTA đang hình thành, tạo thêm động lực tăng trưởng mới để khu vực tiếp tục duy trì vai trò là đầu tàu về tăng trưởng và liên kết kinh tế toàn cầu. Diễn đàn APEC đang đi tiên phong trong thúc đẩy tăng trưởng bền vững thông qua việc thực hiện chiến lược tăng trưởng cân bằng, bao trùm, bền vững, sáng tạo và an toàn. Từ năm 2010 và đang cùng nỗ lực thúc đẩy chiến lược tăng cường tăng trưởng chất lượng, và chưa bao giờ mẫu số chung về một cộng đồng hòa bình, ổn định, phát triển và thịnh vượng lại lớn như ngày hôm nay. Song châu Á-Thái Bình Dương cũng đang phải đối phó với nhiều thách thức lớn. Đó là môi trường hòa bình, an ninh để phát triển còn tiềm ẩn những nhân tố bất ổn. Đó là sự suy giảm tăng trưởng của một số đầu tàu kinh tế trong khu vực. Còn tồn tại một loạt vấn đề phát triển nổi cộm như là tình trạng đói nghèo, khoảng cách phát triển gia tăng, biến đổi khí hậu, thiên tai, già hóa dân số, đô thị hóa, các vấn đề an ninh lương thực, nước, năng lượng, v.v. Từ thực tiễn hợp tác APEC trong hơn 25 năm qua, cũng như là quá trình xây dựng cộng đồng ASEAN, tôi cho rằng để đạt được mục tiêu tăng trưởng bền vững, bao trùm, chúng ta cũng cần có những điều kiện cần và đủ sau đây. Một là cần đặt ưu tiên cao cho nỗ lực xóa nghèo bền vững trong từng nền kinh tế và thu hẹp khoảng cách phát triển giữa các nền kinh tế. Thực hiện hiệu quả an sinh xã hội bền vững, chú trọng các đối tượng dễ bị tổn thương như là trẻ em, phụ nữ, người khuyết tật và người cao tuổi. Thứ hai là nâng cao năng lực người dân thông qua việc xây dựng nền giáo dục chất lượng, nền khoa học công nghệ tiên tiến và nền nông nghiệp bền vững. Trong thời đại kinh tế tri thức, đây là nhân tố quyết định để người dân có đủ khả năng tiếp cận với tiến bộ khoa học và việc làm bền vững. Vấn đề thứ ba là thúc đẩy các mối quan hệ đối tác trên mọi tầng nấc toàn cầu, liên kết khu vực và tiểu vùng để triển khai chương trình nghị sự 2030 về phát triển bền vững và các chương trình, các sáng kiến về tăng trưởng chất lượng, doanh nghiệp vừa và nhỏ, siêu nhỏ và ứng phó với thiên tai, v.v. Chú trọng hỗ trợ các dự án cơ sở hạ tầng nhằm tăng cường kết nối, thu hẹp khoảng cách phát triển, ủng hộ các dự án phát triển của các thành viên như là tầm nhìn ASEAN 2025, tiểu vùng Mekong, v.v. Quan hệ đối tác công tư cũng đóng vai trò rất quan trọng. Các doanh nghiệp cần lấy trách nhiệm xã hội là kim chỉ nam cho hành động, lấy bền vững là nhân tố dẫn dắt, đổi mới sáng tạo, việc nhân rộng các mô hình sản xuất xanh, đầu tư xanh, du lịch xanh, chuỗi cung ứng xanh, v.v. là quyết định đầu tư khôn ngoan vào tương lai. Thưa các bạn, trong giai đoạn mới của công cuộc đổi mới sâu rộng, Việt Nam chúng tôi hết sức coi trọng tăng trưởng bền vững, bao trùm. Chúng tôi coi con người là trung tâm và là mục tiêu của phát triển, gắn kết phát triển kinh tế với xây dựng xã hội tiến bộ và công bằng, luôn chú trọng tăng trưởng xanh, sạch, tiết kiệm tài nguyên, thích ứng và giảm thiểu những tác động của biến đổi khí hậu. Xin chân thành các bạn đã lắng nghe ý kiến của chúng tôi. Xin cảm ơn.
Thank you, President Tsang, for those opening remarks. In fact, there are a couple of points that I would like to come back to a little later. But I'd like to move on to John. John, you're a free trader, okay? You used to be on President Bush's, George W. Bush's Export Council. How do you think free trade helps to promote inclusive growth? Give us a rundown, what you think.
Okay, thank you, Swar, and good afternoon, I guess. I'd love to make some comment. Yes, I'm a proponent of free trade. And so when you think about what free trade they have done for, let's just say, the ASEAN region or the APAC regions, in the last 25 years, the GDP per person had tripled in this region, and people's life expectancy had grew by 10%. So that's all accomplished in the last 25 years. And, you know, literally hundreds of millions of people lifted into the middle class from our poverty. So it's obvious the one biggest thing that happened in the last 25 years are all the free trade agreements that was in place and in exercise. You know, if I look at the Asian Development Bank numbers, I think there was like 140 plus, you know, bilateral and multilateral agreement with the APAC countries. And my understanding is there are like at least about 60 or so in the works. So, I mean, I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit about TPP later on. I'm sure, but so I think, you know, the free trading has really helped open up all the countries. Now, you know, if I quoted some of the Canadian study, now I'm running a Canadian company. I quoted some of the Canadian study. The inequality, so to speak, has really been improved between countries. Now, I know one of the topics that you have looked at in your study was the inequality within the economy or a country has not moved forward or may in some cases worsen. And I think that's only a kind of a step or on a path of progression rather than just to say a negative thing. So this is one of those things that free trade really helped, in my opinion, improve. First of all, it already improved the inequality between countries and economies, and I think it will eventually improve the inequality situation inside a country. But of course, policy has to complement that. But I'll leave it up for you to moderate that part later on.
Yeah, I think we do want to come back to that. I'm sure that other panelists also have a view on that, especially, you know, for a long time, you know, globalization, which also depends on free trade and free markets, has been a mantra for the world, but there are also downsides to that. But let's come back to that. Alan, just as John is very keen on free trade, one of the things that you've always emphasized in your work is empowering women as a way to promote inclusive growth. And I'd love it if you can sort of cite how you see that in terms of education, health, so on and so forth. Families.
Sure. Thank you, Zohair. And thank you, President Song, for your comments as well. Our company is a technology company that is focused on healthcare, life sciences, and a variety of performance materials. And we're very passionate about innovation. We're also very passionate about this topic of empowering women because we see the direct connection between the empowerment of women and economies and sustainable growth. And a great example of that is when you look at the gender inequality of healthcare for women, it's truly amazing. And it's also addressable. That's the optimistic part of this. So diseases like cardiovascular disease and diabetes and even types of cancer, we know this can be addressed through better awareness, and it can be addressed through better education, and it can be addressed through different types of treatment options. And when you do this, you can bring all groups of society, but ironically and statistically, many women are disproportionately disadvantaged. And by leveraging different types of programs and focusing them on the gender side of this, the women's side of this, and recognizing that they are actually disadvantaged in the healthcare environment, we really do believe you can jumpstart many of these economies. And in particular, I think in this APEC area, it's particularly relevant because APEC has to make many tough choices today. It's not easy for governments anywhere in APEC to make choices about where they're going to spend money. And healthcare is some people would see it as a cost, but it's probably an investment. Poor health is a real cost, that's for sure, right? So our company, along with the Philippine government and the US government, worked on a project called Healthy Women, Healthy Economies. And it's a very practical research tool that recommends both policy solutions and pragmatic initiatives to help economies and policymakers in particular figure out what could be done at the grassroots level to bring solutions to these local economies. And we have experience in this area. We have some results, and we have some evidence that it can work at the grassroots level. And particularly, it helps the women. Now, we know that there are probably 860 million women that are at least somewhat disadvantaged in the world. It's a huge and it's a staggering number that we've been reading about and we've researched. And if we can just fractionally empower them, the economic leverage here is tremendous, and not only the right thing to do, but it's a powerful thing to do for the economies.
I want to come back later to the issue of women in an economy, because you've been talking about, I think, largely developing societies where if you improve health care or things like that, basic things like that, it can result in a quantum leap for the betterment of women and their participation in society and the economy. But I want to come back, maybe if we have a chance, to talk about a society like Japan, where this is not an issue, but at the same time, women are not playing the role in the economy that they should, and Japan is not doing as well as they should for one of these reasons. But I'm going to turn to Don first. You have your hobby horse too, just like everybody here, I think. Insurance. to be able to give people financial security, to be able to invest, to save, to retire, invest in their futures as an instrument for inclusive growth.
Thank you. Well, I was really excited to be on the panel and get a chance to talk about these three: growth, equity, and resilience, because I feel like we're on the front lines of all three of those as a member of the insurance industry and as a company that has been participating in the Asia region for over 90 years. And when I say front line, what do I mean by that? We have a presence in 14 markets across the region, and the way we deliver our product and services is through a sales force of 560,000, more than 560,000 agents, and then we also have distribution access through 12,000 bank branches. And what that means is we're in hundreds of communities across the region. We're not in an ivory tower. We're down in the communities, interacting with people, whether that's in Vietnam or Philippines or Indonesia, Malaysia, across the whole region. When we talk about financial services, and everybody in every conference is always tuned in to the importance of financial services for economic development, sometimes that equates to a lot of discussion just about banks, occasionally about stock markets, but insurance is sort of left out of the discussion. And I will put in you mentioned my hobby horse, but just put in a couple of comments as to why that's not the most productive way to think about this. And Al mentioned, the importance of dealing with preventative and healthcare, both delivery of healthcare and prevention of those critical diseases. So when we are providing what is in many cases the first financial product that people buy, maybe it's their bank account is their first product, and then insurance will be their second. But most likely, the first conversation when we talk about inclusion that a new worker or an emerging middle-class household has about long-term savings is in a discussion with their insurance agent. And so we're at the front lines of that inclusion in trying to fill a gap for protection, which is huge. So, the estimate of Asia Pacific from Swiss Re is something like $57 trillion of protection gap. So it's an unlimited potential and need that's out there. But what's not understood often is what are the positive spin-offs in regard to growth and equity and resilience which come along with the sale of those insurance policies. One benefit is by providing that social protection, it's alleviating part of the burden that would otherwise have to be picked up by governments. The president mentioned the need to create sustainable social benefit systems throughout emerging Asia. That's a critical issue. And I think we've seen lots of experience from the West that the private sector being able to provide a certain amount of those benefits makes the government less burdened, and in some cases, some of the public sector benefits that have been put up in some of the Western economies, people could question whether those are sustainable or not. So private sector playing a role is important in that. Second thing, we know that Asia has very high savings rates. In some countries, people would say perhaps the savings rate is too high. And that's interfering with the transition to a consumption-oriented economy. One of the reasons people save that much is because they worry about a catastrophic illness or something happening in the family they're not protected for. They don't have a long-term product they can buy to take care of that. So by buying insurance, we're freeing up, unlocking consumption. And then the final benefit, which is maybe the most fundamental, and then I'll stop here, is when those millions of people that are buying those products, that money is coming in, that's money that's coming out of either short-term deposits, or if they're banked, or if they're not banked, it's coming out of the mattress. That's not productive capital from the perspective of development of an economy. So what the insurance industry is doing, because we're making long-term promises, we like to invest in long-term assets to match against those liabilities. That's good risk management from our perspective, that are made in the country where the savings are coming from, and they're made in local currency. And in some cases, what that means is we are the largest investors in the capital market, so long-term capital markets. So in the case of government bonds, for example, in a lot of the emerging markets in this region, insurance companies are the largest owners of government bonds. This summer in Vietnam, we were very pleased to be able to, in a sense, partner with the government on the first ever 20-year bond, government bond, issued by the government of Vietnam, and Prudential was the largest investor in that bond. So that's a good thing for the government to finance infrastructure and other social needs. It's a good thing for the insurance industry, and in the end, that's providing a good return to all of those savers who would otherwise have that money in the mattress.
Thanks. Josette, Al and Don have been talking about how their companies have an impact on the grassroots. And Tony Fernandez earlier was talking about how people are the greatest resource. President Kino also broached this yesterday in his keynote. Is there a role that Asians can play in their own future in the sense of greater civil society, greater interaction? Are we leveraging Asian grassroots as much as we can and should?
Well, thank you for the question. Certainly the rise of Asia is one of the biggest mega trends of our time. And if we look, 42% of global research and development is now done in Asia. And yet, of 900 Nobel Prizes given since 1901, I believe, only about 68 have been given to Asians. The world hasn't fully seen the brilliance of Asia yet, and yet now we're seeing Asia really rising, and not just taking cues from places like Silicon Valley, but you see innovation originating in Asia and then spreading also to the West. We know that by 2030, Asia will be stronger than Europe and North America combined if you look at GDP, population, military spending, and innovation, investment in innovation. And so I think now is really Asia's time to not only continue with the type of turnaround of poverty that we've seen. We know in 1990 that half of global poverty was in Northeast Asia, and today it's 12%. So these numbers are phenomenal. Asia's lifted more people out of poverty in the last 30 years than all of human history combined. But the idea that Asia now will help define new ways of doing business, new technologies, new innovations, and we're hearing about cities and places where ideas are coming and really kind of coming back also into the more developed economies. So I think this is important. I just want to really echo some of the words that the president said. We're not going to get to our vision and hopes for inclusive growth in the world, and the UN has just declared the new goals, which include by 2030 eradicating extreme poverty in the world. Eradicating it, not cutting it in half, not cutting it by 10%, but eradicating it. This is actually doable. This is actually possible. But we're not going to get there without women, who are, as Alan pointed out, the key. It's like the secret sauce. If you want to get an economy growing and moving, you've got to empower women. And they need to have access to be able to bank, they have to be able to inherit property. All these things have to be kind of corrected in policymaking. They're not going to get there without the elderly, because the world's aging. And the elderly are proving that, especially with connectivity, they can be a vital part of the economy. And they're not going to get there without farmers. And I just want to say that because still to this day in APEC, 60% of GDP is in the rural area. We can't just leapfrog over farmers and our need for food in the world, by the way. We also have to figure out that equation.
So I know you have experience in Africa and used to head the UN's World Food Program. So are you saying that Asia has already jumped over the basic hurdles of extreme poverty, hunger, so on and so forth? Or are there lessons that your Africa experience might have for Asia?
Well, actually, there's more malnutrition in Asia than in Africa. We cannot forget that even though the numbers may be smaller as percentage, the populations of Asia are so huge. And to this day, we have severe numbers in malnutrition and hunger in Asia. So there are people being left behind. And we have to figure out how to include them. And a lot of this is about resiliency. How do we create societies that are resilient? Because when we see natural disasters or war zones or any of these things happening, there are people who will be left behind. I will say that during the world food crisis in 2008, we saw whole nations in Asia unable to buy food. So our resiliency systems are not where they need to be at the macro level. And even as at the individual level, I think we get more skilled. At the macro level, we're highly vulnerable as and Asia still is.
Gisette has brought up resilience. President Song, if I can turn to you, Vietnam is a country that has its share of natural disasters. What initiatives has your government taken to mitigate and indeed try to reinforce resilience in terms of hard infrastructure, dams and so on and so forth, or better infrastructural systems, but even soft infrastructure in terms of education and things like that?
Thưa các bạn, từ cái kinh nghiệm thực tiễn của đất nước chúng tôi cũng xin trao đổi cái chủ đề mà các bạn vừa hỏi. Chúng tôi cho rằng trong thế giới ngày nay càng tùy thuộc và hết sức là bất định. Việc nâng cao năng lực tự cường để mà ứng phó các cái cú sốc và những cái thảm họa đã trở thành yêu cầu hết sức là cấp bách của chúng ta. Chúng tôi cho rằng tăng trưởng bền vững, bao trùm là cái điều kiện hết sức là tiên quyết để xây dựng một cộng đồng tự cường. Đặc biệt là khi châu Á Thái Bình Dương của chúng ta đang phải đối mặt với ngày càng nhiều về vấn đề thiên tai và dịch bệnh và các cú sốc kinh tế và sự gia tăng cả về tần suất và cường độ như thời gian qua mà chúng ta đã chứng kiến. Chúng tôi cho rằng chúng ta nên khắc ghi những cái bài học từ thảm họa ở Nhật Bản như động đất sóng thần, rồi lũ lụt ở Thái Lan, hay là cái cơn bão Hải Yến rất lớn tại Philippines thời gian qua đã gây thiệt hại rất lớn về người và tài sản và tác động rất là sâu sắc vào cái chuỗi cung ứng của khu vực của chúng ta. Từ những cái tình hình như vậy thì tôi xin chia sẻ với các bạn một số suy nghĩ về một số cái biện pháp nhằm tăng trưởng bao trùm thật sự nó giúp xây dựng cộng đồng tự cường theo cái thực tiễn, theo suy nghĩ của chúng tôi. Đó là vấn đề, một là chính phủ thì đương nhiên phải đẩy mạnh cái việc triển khai các cái chính sách nhằm nâng cao được cái tính tự cường dựa trên cái cách tiếp cận toàn diện tổng thể và liên ngành. Chúng ta cần phải đưa cái việc giảm nhẹ và thích ứng biến đổi khí hậu trở thành một cái nội hàm hết sức quan trọng trong chiến lược phát triển của mình. Và vấn đề thứ hai nữa, chúng tôi cho rằng là trong cái việc ứng phó với biến đổi khí hậu, các cú sốc và những cái thảm họa có quy mô lớn, sự nỗ lực chung của một cái cộng đồng, một cái nền kinh tế riêng lẻ là chưa đủ, chắc chắn là chưa đủ. Chúng tôi cho rằng cần có sự chung tay góp sức của tất cả mọi người dân của các nền kinh tế toàn cầu. Chúng ta cũng cần thực hiện nghiêm túc khuôn khổ Sendai về giảm nhẹ rủi ro thiên tai giai đoạn 2015-2030 và nỗ lực để mà hướng tới những cái thỏa thuận tại hội nghị Paris COP21 tháng 12 tới đây mà các quốc gia sẽ tham dự tại hội nghị hết sức quan trọng này. Và cuối cùng, chúng tôi cho rằng một cái vấn đề hết sức quan trọng không thể không trao đổi tại diễn đàn này, đó là vai trò của các bạn, vai trò của các doanh nghiệp là một nhân tố cực kỳ quan trọng và không thể thiếu được. Các doanh nghiệp thì cần thúc đẩy chuyển giao công nghệ, cần thúc đẩy chuyển giao công nghệ đi đôi với ứng dụng công nghệ và việc hỗ trợ cho cộng đồng, cho các nền kinh tế và chính bản thân các bạn trong cái việc mà dự báo, phòng tránh, ứng phó và phục hồi tốt hơn sau các cú sốc và thảm họa thiên tai mà chúng ta đã từng chứng kiến, chúng ta cũng đã từng trải qua những cái thách đố này. Xin trân trọng cảm ơn các bạn.
This is for everybody. Is Beijing's initiative to set up an AIB going to make a difference? And in what way? In terms of building resilience, inclusive growth, whatever. Anyone want to? Don? No?
Well, let me, can I make a comment just
Sure.
on what the president just said, just very briefly, then I'll come back to AIIB, because I think there's a lot to say about that as well. The concluding statement was business can also do a lot to play a role, and I just want to echo, I think that's really true, and I think that's been our experience. Because we're in all of those communities, as I mentioned before, we had a lot of firsthand experience with disasters and disaster relief. I mean, the Philippines, where we sit right now, has been, in a sense, ground zero for some of the worst disasters, natural disasters in the last decade. A couple of years, almost exactly 2 years ago, I think, we had the terrible Yolanda, the typhoon that came through and just inflicted tremendous suffering. And that, when we talk from an equity standpoint, those disasters tend to afflict the very poorest communities the most, and then those tend to be the places that are least protected by social benefits. And so I think, addressing that's really important. We've seen, we actually saw some of the most basic needs in those cases as we were working on relief projects were just to get out very simple instructions, and we've made a partnership with National Geographic Channel to create a program called Safe Steps, and we were very happy that the Philippines' most famous athlete and humanitarian, Manny Pacquiao, became an ambassador for a program we call Safe Steps, which is now started with that, bringing to over 100 million people a day through Nat Geo and terrestrial television across 11 languages and 10 markets across the region. Very, very simple steps about what do you do in the case of a flood or a typhoon to get out of the way? Just get to high ground. We were amazed that you go to two villages, one right next to the other, one had no death at all, the other would have a terrible catastrophe, just simply hadn't gotten the word out to people how to get to high ground and get away. So we've seen experience where we can do this, and we see a lot of other companies now coming into this area using their skills and capabilities to prepare communities for disaster. So I just want to echo that. I think if everybody in the room is from a business, we want to encourage more of that.
Absolutely. John first, then Josette. Okay. Okay.
One of the things that I think we need to think about is what President San had talked about connectivities. I think, local emergency broadcast information and stuff, that all really help. Right. The question is, the disaster is going to happen man-made or otherwise. And I think in order to sustain the growth, so to speak, is to get back to normal as quickly as possible. And when you want to get back to normal as quickly as possible, everybody has to help out. And it is not clear today, with all the government policy that's being set up in the ASEAN, that it's most efficient. I'm not an expert in that, but there are some, I came from the technology world. Just the fact that we have local server, local data requirements, and cross-border data requirements and restriction, I think greatly hamper the recovery steps. The information step is important, but the recovery step is equal, if not more so. So I just want to make that comment. It's a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
So we're on the AIIB. I differed from my government. I've been a diplomat for the US government, and I differed on the decision on AIIB and wrote an op-ed on that early on, and I'll tell you why. We have a $7 trillion gap in infrastructure investment. China does a huge amount of investment into infrastructure, mostly bilateral. There's no conversation between nations about prioritization or what to do or how to do or what's most important. And I've spent a lot of time working with China to encourage them to be part of the multilateral system. I was there serving in the USTR when we brought China into the WTO. I think it's a good step if China says, we want to set up a system to have many nations weighing in on how to prioritize investment into infrastructure. This is important because there's only limited dollars, even with however much China will put into that and other nations, and with the Asia Development Bank, which is very important and does a lot of great work. Even with all of that, we're still going to have a huge gap. So we need to prioritize. It's deadly serious business. By 2025, 440 cities will be accountable for half of global growth. Most of those cities we haven't heard about, and most of them are not ready for the kind of growth pressures and resiliency needs that we have. So I think the AIIB was important. I think it's important to set up systems of transparency and discussion and prioritization. I think the world's got to pull closer together rather than everyone running in their own direction. We can't afford the kind of division when we're facing the kind of challenges that we are facing in the world today.
Could I pick up on that?
Yes, absolutely, Al.
Right. So I think this is a really important aspect because I think there are so many well-intentioned efforts that, you can't criticize this, right? But we have to start picking a few things and target some areas where we can really have leverage, right? I know a little bit about healthcare, so I'll just talk about that. Non-communicable diseases cost the APEC economies somewhere between 7 and 9% of GDP. It's huge. Now, if we did something to address that, we would be really moving the needle, right? That's not the only one I would pick, of course, but it's one that I think would be a high priority area to address. Josette also made another point about the untapped potential of Asia. And I would echo this with my experience in Asia, that I think the industry tends to look at Asia as markets. And I think you need to reverse that and look at Asia as the part of your strategy, global strategy, rather than individual country initiatives. And I think that changes your whole perspective on how you view this whole part of the world.
Just coming
Please.
we need to focus and prioritize, and I also think, coming back to AIIB, or any of the multilateral development banks, whether that's AIIB or the World Bank or the Asia Development Bank, there are many public-backed institutions. But when you add up all the numbers of those institutions and how much is available for infrastructure, it's in the few hundreds of billions of dollars versus the trillions of dollars that are needed. And so what's very important, I think, is we think about focusing is for those institutions, rather than crowding out private investment, to focus on how they can crowd in private investment, because the trillions of dollars that exist out, in the global pension funds and in global insurance companies and global asset management firms that's looking for return. And Asia had the potential for many infrastructure projects with great returns and also which have tremendous social benefit. So if these new and existing public institutions can figure out ways to provide maybe a credit enhancement or other structures that'll encourage private sector to come in together, public-private initiatives, then that'll leverage a lot more capital that can close that gap.
Zora, just to agree with that, because I think what these public institutions can do is help focus governments, help run interference on these projects. It's difficult to do infrastructure these days, as you know, to get all the clearances and approvals and public discussion and to get countries agreeing that this is the way to go. And it's very difficult for the private sector to kind of corral all of those opinions and find a pathway through. But these public institutions can leverage out private capital by helping organize the world and thinking and create the dialogue with the public and others to get these infrastructure projects unleashed. Manila is predicted by Kearney, did a prediction of the top 10 cities that will become the new global cities. Manila is number 2. And we see here that this infrastructure really needs to grow to accommodate that. And this is where I think these banks can really be helpful, is kind of helping clear the pathway, because the public has a right to be involved also in these projects and to say, here's how it's going to affect our lives and here's how it's going to affect our nation.
It's interesting. You know, every year we came to APAC, we talk about early in the green room, that we talk about the same thing for the last 10, 15 years. Every year at APAC, we all come away with lots of hope. And this is what this panel is about, we're lots of hope. The only problem I see right now, and I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but I think we need to be realistic. The economic growth prospect, the projection for the near term in Asia is not high. And if you believe in the whole efficiency of capitalist system, then obviously those investment that we talk about with pension fund and everything will be seeking higher level of return in the safer market that unfortunately will probably favor North America today. But all the stuff that we talk about, whether it be inclusive growth and equality and stuff, needs money and time, but needs money. So I just wanted to make sure that we all kind of grounded so the audience doesn't walk away thinking that we're all smoking some special thing inside the green room. But anyway, I'm not, you know, as I said, I don't want to be a bearer of bad news. There's a lot of enormous opportunity, but I still think that we need to be grounded and do a few things.
Actually, John is being positive, actually. No, you're absolutely right. We were talking about this earlier, that some of the issues just are not going away. Obviously, the main topic of this discussion, of this conversation, inclusive growth, is a big issue, but we're talking about corruption. Don, you were saying about businesses, or was it Al? Sorry, it was Al saying about businesses looking at Asia as a whole. But at the same time, there are a lot of political tensions going on now as we speak. Not every Asian society is progressing at the same rate in terms of politics, freedoms, infrastructure, and so on and so forth. So we have a compartmentalization in some ways. We got some countries in silos. How do we break that down? Gisette, you were talking about cooperation among in terms of funding and finance. And now we have a new alphabet soup acronym, the TPP. Does that help enhance, or does that compete for people's attention? Is it even going to pass Congress in Washington? Anyone?
Let's see, I want to make, I'm sure everybody has an opinion on TPP. I will just make a comment. Let me come from the point of view of the technology side of the equation. I think the great things about TPP are the first time that we have gone away on any multilateral, bilateral discussion, that we all gone away on only physical goods. We in the past, whether it's WTO and everything we talk about, it's always about moving things that we could either count or touch and anything else. So this is the first time that we really are talking things like digital goods, intellectual properties and so forth. Arguably, some of the stuff are very restrictive, and I'm going to leave different countries and to ratify whatever it is that they need to be ratifying. So the only thing that I wanted to caution in this whole TPP conversation, is it going to be a cure to all, which is your point. I today question that. I question that on two fronts. The first front is, we're still talking about the 12 countries equal to about 800 million people of the 2.8 billion potential, not counting India. There are 4 billion people in the ASEAN region, including India. So great that we have 12 countries, which probably represent about 2/3 of the GDP of the whole the Asia Pac. So that's the number one thing. I think we need to be more inclusive. Josette and I talked about a little earlier, I think it's this kind of feel like incremental improvement for the failure of Doha rounds. And I'm not sure this is true. But.
Yeah, one thing that's important, I think, to understand is the GATT, the original kind of global trade agreement, was really about tariffs. It wasn't about the knowledge economy that we have today. It wasn't about the services economy. And TPP, really addresses creating a common language in the movement of services and the knowledge economy in addition to addressing tariffs. This is really, really important. It removes those barriers to doing business, and all the businessmen here know how much is lost in just looking at different rules and regulations and standards and all of that. So when you get a group of countries working together, I think it's about pace setting. And the intention always is to grow these. So TPP isn't meant to be exclusive. It was really to get a group of nations that are willing to set that kind of high standard for the economy that the world is facing in the future. And I think these new trade agreements are really cracking at some of those issues that are so important that can unleash that. So, I think, Zohar, it really helps create the pace. It's why it's called the bicycle theory of trade. You have to keep it moving, or else the world's economy really can grind to a very slow halt as things get glued up without that pace setting.
Thank you. We're running out of time, so I'd like to turn to the floor for any questions. Please identify yourself and the group or the company that you are representing. Thank you. This gentleman first in the front row.
My name's Albert Ting. I live in Taipei and in Ho Chi Minh City. So I have a question for President Sun. Vietnam by now has become a star in terms of its economic performance, but it is not long ago that actually Vietnam faced double-digit inflation. Can you share with the audience maybe 2 or 3 strategies that Vietnam has implemented in the last 5-6 years to set its economic growth on this current trajectory? And then also for the future, what are some of your thoughts on making Vietnam's growth more inclusive? Thank you.
Thưa các bạn, cái con số lạm phát hai con số lâu lắm rồi. Bây giờ thì nó không còn cái con số này nữa. Bây giờ thì lạm phát chỉ một con số mà rất thấp, khoảng độ chừng 1 mấy % thôi, không lớn lắm. Và tăng trưởng thì trong 5 năm qua thì Việt Nam cũng đạt được bình quân khoảng xấp xỉ 6% GDP. Chúng tôi cho rằng cái mức độ tăng trưởng đó, cái chỉ số lạm phát đó thì trong điều kiện hiện nay chúng tôi cho rằng có thể chấp nhận được, tạm thời chấp nhận được. Nhưng mà mục tiêu mà chúng tôi hướng tới như tôi phát biểu hồi nãy phải có một nền kinh tế tăng trưởng bền vững về lâu dài. Muốn được như vậy thì chúng tôi phải tái cấu trúc lại nền kinh tế của mình. Thú thật rằng trong 30 năm đổi mới thì Việt Nam tăng trưởng chủ yếu là theo chiều rộng là chính thôi. Cái hàm lượng về khoa học công nghệ trong nền kinh tế không phải lớn lắm đâu. Cái năng suất lao động của chúng tôi so với nhiều nước trên thế giới cũng không phải là cao, còn nhiều cái mặt còn rất hạn chế. Nên trung tâm điểm của nền kinh tế Việt Nam trong giai đoạn hiện nay để hướng tới tương lai á, là một mặt thì chúng tôi đàm phán một loạt các cái hiệp định thương mại tự do. Việt Nam cũng là một trong 12 thành viên TPP đấy, như các bạn đã biết. Ngoài ra thì chúng tôi đàm phán với 28 thành viên của EU, có thể kết thúc trong năm nay. Thì không còn trở ngại gì lớn lắm để kết thúc được trong năm nay. Cái khu vực thứ ba nữa, Việt Nam và Liên minh tới Á-Âu thì giữa Nga, Belarus, Kazakhstan và một vài nước khác nữa đã kết thúc rồi. Việt Nam, Hàn Quốc cũng đã kết thúc rồi, vân vân, và một số cái tiểu khu vực nữa. Thì đó là cái câu chuyện đó thì Việt Nam mới tiến hành hết sức khẩn trương và hy vọng rằng có thể kết thúc tất cả những cái đối tác đó trong năm nay. Vấn đề thứ hai tôi muốn nói lại là lớn nhất mà bản thân Việt Nam phải làm đó phải tái cấu trúc nền kinh tế, phải cải biến cho nền kinh tế của mình trở lại tăng trưởng theo chiều sâu, phát triển phải bằng năng suất, bằng chất lượng và hiệu quả. chứ không phải dựa quá nhiều vào vốn, dựa quá nhiều về tài nguyên thiên nhiên của bản thân Việt Nam vân vân như các bạn đã theo đuổi. Và tôi nghĩ rằng từ đây đến 20 hoặc trên dưới 20 thì chỉ số lạm phát của Việt Nam không thể trở về 2 con số như ngày xưa nữa đâu. Chúng tôi thật sự đã kiểm soát được cái tình hình, mà nguyên nhân để xảy ra 2 con số cũng xảy ra mấy năm. Như ông bạn ở đây chắc là cũng gặp khó khăn trong kinh doanh tại Việt Nam. Bây giờ nó trải qua, nó qua hết cái giai đoạn đó rồi. Kinh tế vĩ mô hiện nay đã ổn định trở lại và đi vào phát triển ổn định. GDP bình quân chỉ 6%, tôi cho rằng đối với nền kinh tế Việt Nam không phải là cao. Đối với chúng tôi thì cỡ 7-8% mỗi năm là hoàn toàn có thể diễn ra trong tương lai rất là gần. Và sự thật trong 30 năm đổi mới thì khoảng 15 năm cũng đã đạt cái con số bình quân 8%. Còn 7-8 năm thì bình quân khoảng 7%, và 5 năm nay thì bình quân khoảng xấp xỉ 6%. Xin cảm ơn.
Okay, so you got a pledge from the president. You heard it here first, okay? Anyone? A gentleman there.
It works.
It works. Yeah, it's on.
喂，尊敬的张军灿总统你好，我是来自中国陕西好投资控股集团的副播董事长。大家都知道，中国与越南有着2000多年的历史。由于历史文化和特殊地理因素，自古以来，中国是越南最大的邻邦国家。同时，中国和越南都是东盟成员国和亚太经济体。习主席11月6号刚刚访问过贵国。请问总统先生，你认为越南将如何在中国东盟次区活动中发挥更好的作用？两国将在哪些区域领域进行更紧密的合作呢？谢谢您。
Thưa các bạn, như các bạn đã biết thì Chủ tịch Trung Quốc Tập Cận Bình đã thăm chúng tôi cái đây cũng mấy hôm thôi, cũng mới thăm đi thôi. Và trong cái cuộc gặp gỡ cấp cao này thì trao đổi nhiều vấn đề. Trong đó một vấn đề nó nổi lên rất lớn mà các bạn cũng quan tâm, đó là vấn đề quan hệ kinh tế giữa hai nước. Như các bạn biết thì quan hệ kinh tế Việt Nam Trung Quốc hiện nay, Trung Quốc là một trong những cái thị trường lớn nhất của Việt Nam. Nếu nói về xuất nhập khẩu thì Trung Quốc đứng đầu so với các đối tác khác ở trên thế giới mà Việt Nam có quan hệ. Còn đầu tư thì chưa nhiều, đầu tư từ FDI thì chưa nhiều, đầu tư gián tiếp cũng chưa nhiều. Chúng tôi hy vọng rằng trong những cuộc gặp gỡ như vừa rồi đó, thì cái tình hình về thương mại sẽ tiếp tục gia tăng. Và chúng tôi đã thỏa thuận với nhau như vậy, và đầu tư cũng sẽ gia tăng. Trong cuộc gặp gỡ đó thì rất nhiều cái văn bản hợp tác đã được ký kết, cộng với những cái văn bản ký kết lâu nay giữa Trung Quốc và Việt Nam, thì phải nói khối lượng công việc rất lớn, những thỏa thuận rất lớn. Hy vọng rằng trong tương lai gần thì vấn đề mậu dịch, vấn đề thương mại sẽ tiếp tục tăng cường, và vấn đề đầu tư trực tiếp Trung Quốc và Việt Nam cũng tiếp tục gia tăng. Chắc chắn nó sẽ diễn ra được như vậy. Còn Việt Nam có vai trò như thế nào thì trong khu vực ASEAN thì như các bạn đã biết, Việt Nam là một trong những quốc gia mới tham gia sau này trong cái cộng đồng ASEAN. Và chúng tôi xác định rằng khi Việt Nam tham gia vào một tổ chức khu vực và quốc tế, Việt Nam sẽ làm hết sức mình sẽ để cho xứng đáng với tư cách là một thành viên có trách nhiệm trong những tổ chức mà mình tham gia. Và tôi cho rằng từ khi Việt Nam đã trở thành thành viên chính thức của ASEAN đến bây giờ, chúng tôi đã cố gắng tối đa, đã thực hiện đúng như lời hứa khi làm cái đơn mà xin gia nhập vào một tổ chức như vậy. Và hiện nay thì Việt Nam cũng là trong một trong những thành viên hết sức tích cực, làm hết sức mình để rồi xây dựng một cộng đồng ASEAN vào cuối năm nay, nó hình thành cộng đồng ASEAN. Như thế là 1 tháng 1 2016 chắc chắn rằng ASEAN là một cộng đồng mà thống nhất trong đa dạng như các bạn đã biết. và chúng tôi rất hy vọng trên 3 trụ cột chính của cộng đồng này thì ASEAN vẫn sẽ đóng được vai trò trung tâm như lâu nay trong khu vực và trong các mối quan hệ với các cái quốc gia khác quan tâm với ASEAN của chúng tôi. Xin rất cảm ơn.
Thank you. I just want to go very quickly for anyone who wanted to say something that they felt they didn't have a chance to. I'm going to start with Josette.
I guess I would say the one thing I don't feel we really touched on is the role of SMEs in resilience. And I just came from the SME Summit, which for the first time, I think, in APEC was held at the same time as this. 99% of businesses in the Philippines are SMEs. 97% in Vietnam are SMEs. If you read the World Bank's Doing Business report, which I love, you'll get the whole story on whether a country's going to grow or not, based on how many days does it take to start a business, how much do you have to invest to get the licenses, and the countries that are clearing the way for the small business economy. And let's remember, Uber and Alibaba started as small businesses just a few years ago. So these are the tiger companies of the future. But we have to remember the SMEs are the heart and soul, really, of the APEC economy, and that any resilience, any growth, and any inclusiveness has to include them in the strategies that governments are taking.
No, thanks for that. We actually talked about it previously, but you're right, we didn't get to it on this panel. Thank you for bringing it up. Don?
We didn't get to talk about the next big challenge of demographics in Asia, which is aging. Everybody knows that Japan is already an aging country, that China is on a path to go from young country to an old country even faster, making the journey in about 20 years. Japan made it in 21. What we don't realize is how fast most of the rest of ASEAN is aging. That between 2010 and 2050, the number of people over 65 is going to go up by about 4 times, about another 91 million people over 65. Asia's aging about 3 times faster than the West did because of falling birth rates and increasing life expectancy. That's an issue that's going to create enormous needs for the business that Al's in terms of healthcare and for ours in terms of funding. But it also puts a great emphasis on the role of government to create the incentives for more savings, to create pension systems that will provide income security for a vast number of people that will be older 20, 30 years from now, that many countries do not have pension systems, and for the development of the capital markets. I think that's a great opportunity, but it's a lot of work that needs to be tackled urgently.
Al?
Thanks, Harry. So, we talked a lot about getting the gender inequality in healthcare right, but there's also the gender inequality side in the workplace. And we need to continue to really focus on that. Social psychologists, organizational effectiveness experts would say that you really have to have diversity represented at least to a minimum of 30% in your ranks of your organization, and therefore what we've done, I think, as companies, we're moving, but it's obviously not enough. We're trying to do more in our own company, and I think that's something when we really move those numbers up, we will see even more untapped potential in our companies. We've seen that from personal experience. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. John?
In order to help promote inclusiveness, I think one thing we didn't have the chance to talk about is the cross-border people exchange. The whole immigration thing, if you look at all the free trade agreements, it seldom touch people. And everybody always talk about human resources as the number one thing. We always talk about Nobel Prize not being out here. You talk about, 2/3 of the engineers at Silicon Valley are Asians, blah, 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 blah. So we never really touched that point. Now, this gets really compounded now with the whole security issues. And so, I mean, I think whatever the ASEANs or the FTAP or the TPP, however way you want to think about this, really need to address the human resource society equation. Then I have one more comment about, I think it will be a tendency. I always thought about, you know, the Asians had such strong math and science background, and it represents so much of a technology workforce around the world, but you never really get the margin of this, of APAC that gone up. You know, it's always about manufacturing and labor, you know, added value of laborers and so forth, export-import type situations. You know, I think that needs to be examined tremendously, in my personal opinion. And again, this is could be addressed by more of a cross-border stuff inside the ASEAN in order to get everybody inclusively addressed. So the one thing is we don't want to do is to take so-called, you know, take the people who have and give it to the people who have not. Then you have this whole transfer of wealth, so to speak, or pay your fair share, whatever the right word is. But we want to do is to increase the opportunity of the people that have not, and so that they could become have. So that's I think that's a topic of a big topic of some future dates.
Okay, another panel. President Sang, would you have some closing remarks?
Thưa các bạn, tôi cho rằng 25 năm qua, APEC chúng ta đã đi tiên phong thúc đẩy tăng trưởng và liên kết trong khu vực. Và năm 2015 ghi dấu một cái giai đoạn mới của hợp tác APEC vì một cái châu Á Thái Bình Dương năng động, gắn kết, tự cường và thịnh vượng. Trong nỗ lực thực hiện mục tiêu chung này, tôi cho rằng không thể thiếu sự đồng hành và tham gia của cộng đồng doanh nghiệp mà APEC của chúng ta hết sức là quan trọng. Với những cái thành tựu nổi bật trong đổi mới và hội nhập quốc tế sâu rộng, cùng với việc mà chúng tôi đang hoàn tất đàm phán 4 cái đàm FTA thế hệ mới trong năm nay, thì tôi cho rằng Việt Nam đang là trong một cái tâm thế mới để cùng các cái nền kinh tế thành viên, và đặc biệt là các bạn nỗ lực triển khai tăng trưởng bao trùm, công bằng và tự cường. Và trên tinh thần như vậy, trong một dòng chảy hợp tác của APEC hướng tới cái việc đăng cai APEC năm 2017 tại Việt Nam của chúng tôi, Việt Nam chúng tôi sẽ tiếp tục đồng hành mạnh mẽ cùng các bạn để cùng nhau thúc đẩy tăng trưởng liên tục trong khu vực của chúng ta. Xin rất là cảm ơn.
And thank you all of you, and thank you.